It was the darkest hour before dawn. My small mud hut was pitch black. I opened my eyes as a sharp, familiar pain jolted me awake. I didn't make a sound. For 3 years, I'd learned to control my breathing the moment the agony hit. I held it in, then let it out slowly, making sure the overseer next door wouldn't hear a lowly handyman groaning in the night. A 2-inch gash ran straight across it. The flesh was flipped open, yet there was no scab and no blood. The wound started throbbing again. It wasn't a pulse. It was a deep, rhythmic tremor, like something was buried underneath the skin, trying to turn over. 3 years ago, someone found me collapsed in a pile of rocks behind the Qingyun Sect Mountains. I was covered in blood. My cultivation was completely destroyed, and I remembered nothing. My identity, my past, it had all been wiped clean. The only thing I had left was this wound. The overseer told me that since I was awake, I had to work. So, I became a handyman for the sect. I sat up and pulled on my outer tunic. My finger brushed the wound, and I paused. It didn't actually hurt. In 3 years, this injury had never caused real pain. It just throbbed. "What are you?" I whispered. There was no answer. The wound glowed with a faint, ghostly light in the moonlight, vanishing in a blink. I thought I was hallucinating. I tied my cuffs, grabbed my wooden buckets, and headed out. The mountain path had over 1,000 stone steps. I carried 2 full buckets of water, the shoulder pole digging into my calloused skin. My steps were steady. As I passed the martial arts field, several outer disciples were practicing. Their swords flashed, and their sword chi sliced through the heavy mist, thumping against wooden training posts. "The handyman is here again," one disciple laughed. "I heard they picked him up from the back mountain 3 years ago. His cultivation is gone. He remembers nothing. A piece of trash like that belongs to the water buckets." I kept my head down and walked past them. I didn't stop. I didn't look up. My pace stayed exactly the same, but my right hand tightened its grip on the pole. My palm was throbbing again. I'd spent 3 years figuring out the pattern. Every time I got close to someone carrying a sword, this wound reacted. One disciple casually flicked his wrist. A burst of sword chi flew 6 feet, grazing my back and snapping a small tree branch. My shoulders stiffened for a second. I didn't turn around. I kept walking. The wound in my palm throbbed harder now, like something was trying to claw its way out. At dusk, I returned to my hut. I shut the door and slid the bolt home. I set the buckets in the corner and sat on the edge of my bed. I unwound the cloth strips from my right hand, exposing the wound to the last rays of the setting sun. I held my hand up to the window to see better. Deep inside the gash, a tiny spark of light flickered. I froze. In 3 years, this was the first time the wound had changed. I reached out with my other hand, and the moment my fingertip touched the edge of the cut, a piercing pain shot up my arm. It surged through my meridians, hit my shoulder, climbed my throat, and finally exploded in my brain. I saw something, not with my eyes, but with my entire consciousness. The sky cracked open. Fire rained down from the rift like a reverse storm. The ground shook, mountains collapsed, and forests burned. Someone was screaming, their voice torn apart by the wind. Then, a streak of sword light rose from the horizon, tearing the heavens apart. The vision snapped. I jerked my hand back, gasping for air, my forehead drenched in cold sweat. The glow was gone. The wound looked normal again. I stared at it for a long time, then picked up a sewing needle from the table. I wiped it on my hem, hesitated for 2 breaths, and then poked the needle into the wound. The tip hit something. It was cold, hard, and sharp. It wasn't bone. I nudged it gently. The object moved just a fraction. I gritted my teeth and tried to pry it out. Agony exploded in my palm, making my back arch. "Stop poking. It itches." The voice rang directly in my head. It didn't come through my ears. It was like someone was speaking from the depths of my mind. I bolted upright, my back hitting the wall. The needle clattered to the floor. I scanned the room with wide eyes. It was empty. "Who's there?" "You're looking at me," the voice said. It sounded impatient, old, and tired. "I'm a fragment of a sword tip." I gripped my right hand until my knuckles turned white. My throat felt dry. "Who are you?" There was a long silence. "My name is Lu Jiyuan," the voice said flatly. 300 years ago, they said I conspired with demons and killed me." He spoke as if it were a trivial matter. But they didn't finish the job. I sealed the last wisp of my sword's soul into your palm. Why me? An even longer silence followed. Because you are my legacy. You've forgotten how you got here, but the 300 hidden scars on your body. I carved those in myself, one by one, when I passed you the wounded sword art. They weren't earned through practice. They were forced into you. I stripped off my shirt and stood before a cracked, rusty bronze mirror. It was blurry, but I could see the outlines. My back, my arms, my ribs, they were covered in faint white marks. They looked like old scars, but shallower. I turned around and counted them in the mirror. From my shoulders to my calves, there were exactly 300. Not one more, not one less. The wounded sword art, the voice said calmly. Every time you are struck, you steal a sword technique from your opponent. Every scar on your body locks a different technique away. My finger pressed against a white mark below my collarbone. Techniques. To activate them, you only need one thing: to be hit. When someone pours their sword intent into the corresponding scar, that technique will return to your mind. I lowered my hand. The moonlight hit my body, making the white marks look like dried-up riverbeds. You mean, if I want to get stronger, I have to get stabbed? Exactly. The harder you're hit, the faster you learn. I got dressed and sat back on the bed. I looked at my palm. The glow had faded, and the wound looked the same as it had 3 hours ago. But I knew better now. I stood up and pushed open the window. The night wind rushed in, smelling of pine and dew. The martial arts field in the distance was empty, the moonlight laying over the stone floor like a layer of frost. My eyes landed on a new notice posted on the courtyard wall. I'd glimpsed it while carrying water earlier, but hadn't looked closely. The moonlight hit it perfectly now. The words were clear: *entry disciple recruitment. Tomorrow at dawn. Martial arts field arena. Handymen and rogue cultivators may apply. I paused. 2 breaths later, I scrapped my plan of sneaking around to watch disciples practice. Why watch from the shadows when I could get hit in the light? Decent brains, the voice remarked, sounding surprised. But the risk is high. Everyone will be watching. If you're exposed, you're dead. Then I better not die, I muttered. I stood by the window, my face expressionless, but I slowly clenched my right fist. The wound in my palm was burning. Sign up. Get on stage. Get hit. Survive. Those were the 3 steps. If I lost the gamble, it didn't matter. I was already at the bottom. But if I won, I didn't smile, but my muscles twitched with the weight of the decision. Tomorrow, I was signing up. The wind blew through the curtains, tugging at my sleeve. Underneath the fabric, the 2-inch wound flashed with a sudden, silver light. As the sky turned gray, I sat on the edge of my bed and began rewrapping the cloth around my hand. The test was about to begin. I finished rewrapping the cloth. The wound in my palm throbbed with a dull, rhythmic pulse, like a second heart. I stood up, straightened my rough clothes, and pushed open the door. The notice was still there, pasted firmly to the courtyard wall. Entry disciple recruitment. I stood before it for a few seconds, reading the words one last time, then turned and headed toward the martial arts field. I had no sword. I had no cultivation. My right hand was bound in cloth, the sleeve pulled down low to hide the gash in my palm. I just walked. You're planning to go up there empty-handed? The voice in my palm was low. Then why don't you conjure a weapon for me? I muttered. The voice went silent for a moment. Fine. You've got guts. I didn't reply. The morning dew on the stone steps soaked into the fabric of my shoes. In the center of the field, a massive arena had been built from black stone, 10 yards square. For thick wooden pillars stood at the corners, connected by heavy ropes to mark the boundary. Rows of wooden benches were already packed with people. Most were outer sect disciples, but I saw a few rogue cultivators in mismatched gear and even 3 or 4 inner sect disciples in their distinct blue robes. I walked to the registration desk. A middle-aged manager sat behind a wooden table, flipping through a ledger without looking up. Name: Lu Yuan. He glanced up at me, his eyes lingering on my handyman clothes, but he didn't comment. Status: handyman. He scribbled a few notes and handed me a rough wooden token. Keep this. First round, Platform 3, Group A. Your opponent will hand over their token when they arrive. I took the wood. It felt coarse. On the front, it said Group A3. On the back, someone had written a single word in ink: Saber. A saber, the voice whispered. Your opponent uses a blade. Any problems? You can still forfeit. I tucked the token into my chest pocket. No problems. I walked toward the staging area at the east side of the arena. The wound in my palm started jumping again. Thump, thump, just like a heartbeat. 7 or 8 people were already waiting. Some were stretching, others were leaning against their weapons with their eyes closed. I leaned against a wooden pillar and scanned the crowd. I found him. He was standing on the west side, his back to me. He was half a head taller than I was, with broad shoulders and a heavy black iron saber hanging from his waist. The scabbard was badly worn, and the hilt was wrapped in old, dark brown cloth. He was chatting with someone, laughing occasionally, his posture relaxed. He kept his weight on his left foot, a habit of a right-handed fighter. Zhao Taizhan, someone nearby whispered. A guard from the mines. He's been at it for 5 years. That's a man who's actually tasted blood, not like these outer sect kids playing with sticks. He's at the 6th level of the spirit vein realm. 6 levels higher than you. The voice in my palm reminded me. But his cultivation isn't the problem. What do you mean? I thought. Spirit vein levels are just about how much energy you can hold. It has nothing to do with technique. His power will pressure you, but the real danger is that saber. Look at the blade. See that faint red line? I squinted. From 20 paces away, I could just barely see a dark, reddish vein running along the spine of the blade. It looked like dried blood soaked into the very iron. Sword intent, the voice said. That blade has killed many times. He won't hesitate when he swings. I didn't answer. I shoved my right hand deeper into my sleeve. The wound was getting hot. A gong sounded. Group A, number 3, Lu Yuan versus Zhao Taizhan. I stepped onto the platform. The black stone was cold and rough under my feet, designed for grip. My opponent vaulted onto the stage with practiced ease. He was in his 30s, with a square face and a jagged scar across his jaw. Zhao Taizhan stood his ground and looked me over. His eyes stopped on my empty hands for a split second. Where's your weapon? I don't have one, I said. Going empty-handed. He scoffed and looked down at the manager. What is this? He's coming up here with nothing. The manager barely glanced up from his book. The rules don't say you have to bring a weapon. He can use his hands if he wants. Zhao Taizhan looked back at me, his expression turning mocking. Fine. Don't say I bullied you. If you're still standing after 3 moves, I'll count it as your win. The crowd started whispering. I said nothing. I let my right arm hang naturally, my sleeve hiding the bandages. The gong rang again. Begin. Zhao Taizhan drew his blade. As the steel cleared the scabbard, I saw the dark red vein clearly. It ran from the tip to the guard like a frozen line of blood. The edge was thin, polished to a mirror finish from years of use. He didn't waste time with words. He lunged, his hips low, the blade whistling in a brutal upward diagonal. It was simple, direct, and incredibly fast. The chatter from the crowd died instantly. The air seemed to tear as the blade moved. I watched the light of the steel closing in. I had one thought. I can't dodge this. At the 6th level of Spirit Vein, his speed was twice what I'd anticipated. Even if I tried to move, my body wouldn't react in time. So, I didn't move away. I stepped half a pace back and lifted my right arm slightly, intentionally exposing the area under my left ribs to the path of the blade. I knew that spot well. It was an old injury. The blade sliced into the outside of my upper left arm. It wasn't a direct hit. The tip scraped against the bone, opening a 2-inch gash. The sensation of the cold steel cutting through my skin felt like a ruler measuring my limits. In that instant, the intent within the blade seemed to come alive. It crawled into the wound and surged into my meridians. It hurt, but it wasn't the pain of a cut. It felt like something deep inside me was being ripped open, like a thread that had been buried in my flesh for years was suddenly being pulled out. The power surged up my arm, through my shoulder, past my throat, and finally exploded in my mind. Information flooded my brain. Water breaker. The trajectory of the swing. The angle of the spiritual energy. The timing of the secondary strike after impact. The shift in balance after the follow-through. Every detail was branded into my memory. But then I realized something. I wasn't stealing a sword technique. I was stealing a saber style. A saber? I asked internally. Power is power, the voice said calmly. Don't be picky. It works. I stumbled back, my left hand hitting the stone floor to keep me from falling. I dropped to one knee. Blood began to seep from the wound, dripping onto the black stone. Zhao Taizhan frowned, lowering his blade. Down after one hit. I looked up. I was panting, my forehead drenched in cold sweat. But I wasn't in pain. I felt a strange, cold clarity. Thank you. Zhao Taizhan blinked, confused. What? I didn't explain. I stood up, pressing my left hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. I could feel a strange heat circulating around the edges of the cut, as if something had just taken root there. The manager paused, then announced, Lu Yuan is still standing. First round pass. The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some hissed, but most were just confused. A handyman taking a hit from a 6th-level fighter and staying on his feet was unheard of. High up in the stands, a young woman in intersect blue sat at the very edge. She didn't join the chatter. She just stared at the stage. Interesting, she whispered to herself. An intersect disciple leaned over. What's interesting? The kid got lucky. He took a hit and didn't fall. That's all. She didn't look away from me. It wasn't luck. Then what was it? She didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were fixed on my right hand, the one I kept hidden in my sleeve. I hadn't shown it once, from the moment I stepped up to the moment I walked off. When he took that hit, she murmured, he didn't try to dodge. He moved into it. He moved into the blade on purpose. The disciple said, stunned. You're saying he did it intentionally? I don't know, the young woman replied, her voice trailing off. Maybe I saw it wrong. She said the words, but her eyes never left my back as I disappeared into the crowd behind the stage. I found a quiet, deserted corner near the edge of the martial arts field and leaned against the cold stone wall. I kept my head down, pressing my left hand firmly against the wound on my right arm. The bleeding had stopped, but the heat, that strange, pulsing flow, was still there, radiating from the cut. I closed my eyes. In my mind, I replayed that move over and over. Water Severer. It was a diagonal slash. The power didn't come from the wrist, it started in the waist. Once the blade bit into the target, the wrist snapped in a lightning-fast reversal. It was designed to create a secondary impact inside the body, tearing the wound wider. Then, as the move finished, the center of gravity dropped, and the blade was pulled upward to prevent a counterattack. I opened my eyes. It was all there. Every detail. How does it feel? The voice in my palm asked. Like someone just poured a bucket of information into my brain, I whispered. What was that move called? Water Severer. The voice paused for a heartbeat. Not bad. To pick up a technique with its own intent on your first try, your luck isn't terrible. But I don't have a blade. I countered. Sabers, swords, the way you generate power is the same, the voice said dismissively. Memorize it first. We'll worry about the weapon later. I stood up straight and glanced toward the stage. The next round had already begun, and the roar of the crowd was building again. I looked down at my right hand. Even through the thick bandages, I could feel my palm growing warm, as if it were responding to the memory of that strike. I tried to make a fist. I could only close it halfway before a piercing, bone-deep pain shot up my arm. How many times can I use this? I asked. Once you learn it, it's yours, the voice said calmly. Things carved into your bones don't just disappear. But there's a reason I said stolen techniques can't be used repeatedly. You can use it, but look at your body. Your spiritual meridians aren't open. Your dantian is empty. You use this once, and you'll need half a day to recover. Water Severer relies on an instant burst of power from the waist. It's easy to throw the punch, but whether your body can handle the recoil is another story. I stayed silent for a moment. So, I've learned it, but I might not be able to actually pull it off. Exactly. It's carved into your mind now. But whether you can actually launch it from your body depends on how many rounds you survive tomorrow. I didn't answer. I tucked my right hand back into my sleeve and closed my eyes again. I ran through the Water Severer 3 more times. The trajectory of the blade, the snap of the waist, the timing of the wrist. Every inch was clear. It was etched into my soul. High up in the stands, Su Qinwan took a slow sip of tea. The intersect disciple next to her was still rambling about the previous fight, but she wasn't listening. She was thinking about the moment I had bowed my head after taking the hit. In that split second, my right hand had moved in a tiny, precise arc. It was a movement only someone with 10 years of discipline training could make. Yet, I was just a handyman with a ruined cultivation who had appeared out of nowhere 3 years ago. "Who are you?" she murmured, her voice almost lost in the wind. The sun climbed higher. The crowd at the martial arts field had doubled. Half the participants had been eliminated in the first round, and the remaining matches promised more excitement. The manager stood by the stage, flipping through the roster for the second round. Group A, second round. Lu Yuan versus Sun Xiaoyi. A wave of mocking laughter erupted. Sun Xiaoyi was the sycophant who had been jeering at me all morning. He was short with a thin, rat-like face and a standard-issue iron sword hanging from his hip. He grinned, flipped onto the stage, and purposely slammed his scabbard against the stone floor as he landed. "I called you a waste this morning," he sneered. "I didn't think I'd get to personally kick your ass this afternoon." I didn't say a word. I walked onto the stage with steady, measured steps and took my position. My right hand stayed hidden in my sleeve. My left arm was bandaged, a small patch of dried blood showing through the cloth. Empty-handed again. Sun Xiaoyi scoffed. "You think everyone is like Zhao Taizhan? You think I won't kill you with one strike?" I ignored him. My eyes scanned the stage floor. Ever since the first round, I had memorized every flaw in this arena. The missing corner on the third stone slab in the southeast. It was slippery. The dark bloodstain in the center. The visible crack near the western wooden pillar. I mapped it all out. Then, I looked at his sword. "Begin." Sun Xiaoyi drew his blade and lunged. The tip of the sword aimed straight for my chest. It wasn't fast. He was only at the third level of the Spirit Meridian realm. His strength and speed were far below Zhao Tieshan's. A thin layer of white sword qi coated the blade. It wasn't true spiritual energy, but it was enough to punch a hole through bone. I stepped to the side, moving my right foot half a step back and to the left. I had already picked this spot in my head. My foot landed perfectly on the solid stone right next to the broken slab. The sword hissed past my chest, missing by 2 inches. Sun Xiaoyi growled and pulled his sword back, swinging it horizontally at my waist. I retreated with my left foot, stepping onto the edge of the blood-stained slab. My soul slipped slightly on the dried gore, and I used that momentum to drop my center of gravity. The blade whistled over my head, clipping a few strands of my hair. "Come on, Xiaoyi. You can't even hit him," someone yelled from the crowd. Sun Xiaoyi's face flushed red. He gritted his teeth and launched a third strike, a diagonal slash from my left shoulder to my right ribs. This time, I didn't retreat. I stepped forward, planting my foot right in that stone crack I'd spotted earlier. I slipped inside his guard, brushing past his right shoulder and ending up behind him. He swung at thin air, stumbling forward as he struggled to keep his balance. The crowd went quiet for a second before erupting into even louder laughter. Sun Xiaoyi spun around, his face beet red. "Quit scurrying around like a damn rat." I didn't answer. I stood on the edge of the stage, my breathing steady. I watched his sword hand. His grip was still firm, but his muscles were tightening. At the third level, his spiritual reserves were limited. After 7 or 8 consecutive strikes, his sword qi would start to fade. Almost time. Up in the stands, Su Qinwan watched intently. The people around her were laughing at Sun Xiaoyi for failing to hit a handyman, but she wasn't smiling. Her eyes followed my feet. "This kid is so lucky," the disciple next to her remarked. "He misses by a hair every single time." "It's not luck," Su Qinwan said. "What?" She didn't explain immediately. She was counting in her head. That was my 47th step since the match began. From the first moment I stepped onto the stage, I hadn't misplaced a single foot. It was as if I were walking a line that only I could see. And then, Sun Xiaoyi lunged again. He stepped right onto the broken stone slab. His foot slipped, and his balance shattered. 47 steps, Su Qinwan whispered. "He's been calculating the layout of that stage since the first round. He hasn't made a single mistake. It's not luck. He planned this." The disciple stared at her, speechless. He counted. He pre-counted his steps. She didn't say anything more, but her gaze shifted. I wasn't just interesting anymore. Now, she was really watching. Sun Xiaoyi threw his 13th strike. He still hadn't touched me. The laughter from the crowd changed. They weren't mocking me anymore. They were mocking Sun Xiaoyi. "Xiaoyi, are you even trying?" someone yelled. "You can't even touch a handyman." Did you practice your sword skills with a dog? Sun Xiaoyi's face turned a deep, angry red. The hand holding his sword began to tremble. It wasn't fatigue, it was pure, desperate frustration. He was panting heavily now. The white sword chi coating his blade had faded so much it was almost invisible. He was at the 3rd level of the spirit vein realm. After 13 consecutive full-strength strikes, his spiritual energy was bone dry. I stood 5 paces away from him. My posture was relaxed, my breathing steady. Stop! Stop dodging, you coward! Sun Xiaoyi hissed, his voice shaking. I didn't say a word. I just shifted my gaze down an inch, focusing on his right foot. He didn't realize it, but he was standing right on the edge of that chipped stone slab I'd noted earlier. I took one small step to the left. It was a tiny movement, but it triggered his instinct. He pivoted to follow me, putting all his weight onto his right foot to launch an attack. The edge of the broken slab gave way. His foot slipped. Sun Xiaoyi's balance vanished. His body lurched violently to the left, his sword swinging wildly over his head. His entire right side was wide open, a massive, gaping hole in his defense. He was like a door blown open by a gale. I saw the opening. Everyone in the crowd saw it. That single mistake was enough for me to kill him 3 times over. But I didn't move. I stayed right where I was, staring at his exposed ribs, and then I slowly took a step back. 1 step, empty-handed. No attack. Up in the stands, Su Qinwan's eyes narrowed. Sun Xiaoyi managed to steady himself and stand upright. His face wasn't red anymore. It was deathly pale. He looked down at his shaking hand. He knew that in that split second, if I had wanted him dead, he'd be a corpse on the stage. He looked up at me. I met his eyes with no expression at all. No pride, no triumph, no emotion. To him, that silence was more terrifying than any insult. His hand shook harder. He didn't dare swing his sword again. The arena went silent for a few breaths. Everyone realized the truth. It wasn't luck. I had completely suppressed him. Su Qinwan leaned back in her chair, her eyes locked on me. The inner sect disciple beside her opened his mouth, but couldn't find the words. He wasn't retreating. The disciple muttered to himself. He was waiting. Su Qinwan reached for the jade pendant at her waist. Its surface was still warm. The thing she had been waiting 3 years for had finally appeared. I remained still in the center of the stage. My right hand was still tucked inside my sleeve, the wound in my palm throbbing with heat. I knew Sun Xiaoyi was finished. I knew people were watching me from the stands, but I didn't look up. I was waiting for someone actually worth using my water-severing strike on. The 3rd round began as the sun started to dip in the sky. The crowd didn't thin out. If anything, more people arrived. After the 2nd round of eliminations, only 4 of us were left. The supervisor flipped through the register. Group A, 3rd round, Lin Yuan versus Wang Dajiao. The crowd went quiet for a second before erupting into whispers. Wang Dajiao hadn't appeared in the first 2 rounds because he'd received a bye. He was a 6th-level spirit vein disciple, and like Zhao Taizhan, he came from the mines. But unlike Zhao, he used a sword. He walked onto the stage with slow, deliberate steps. He was thinner than Zhao Taizhan, but his shoulders were set low and his center of gravity was incredibly stable. Every step he took looked like he was growing roots into the stone. An iron sword hung at his waist. The scabbard was worn in the exact same spot as Zhao's, the mark of the same training, the same life. He stopped in the center of the stage. He didn't look at my face. His eyes went straight to my right hand, still hidden in my sleeve. "What do you have wrapped around your hand?" he asked. I stayed silent. He stared at my sleeve for a few seconds, then looked away. "Fine, let's go." He didn't mock me like the others. He simply drew his sword and held it level at his side, waiting for the signal. I stepped forward, my right hand tightening inside my sleeve. The wound in my palm wasn't just throbbing now. It was vibrating at a different frequency. It was a warning. This man was just like Zhao Taizhan. "He knows something is wrong with your hand," a low voice whispered in my mind. "He's not going to be easy." The supervisor raised his hand. "Begin." Wang Dajiao moved. He didn't thrust his sword. He pushed it forward horizontally, using it more like a blade. It was a heavy, sweeping motion that covered a massive area, cutting off any chance of me dodging to the sides. I stepped back, my right foot landing on a solid stone slab I'd memorized. But Wang Dajiao's sword followed me perfectly, as if he knew exactly where I was going to retreat. The edge of the blade grazed my chest, slicing a 2-inch tear through my clothes. No blood, but the fabric fluttered open. He wasn't just watching me. He was reading me. Wang Dajiao pulled his sword back, but didn't follow up. He stood his ground, the tip of his sword lowered slightly. "Your footwork is good," he said. "That's probably how you won the first 2 rounds. But it doesn't matter how fast your feet are. I'm not looking at your feet. I'm looking at your shoulders." My pupils contracted. "Your shoulders twitch right before you change direction," he continued. "It's a tiny movement. Normal people can't see it. But you've seen Tieshan's technique, so you should know what kind of life we lived in the mines. When a tunnel collapses, the sound comes before the walls crack. A shoulder moves before a body shifts. Being half a breath slow means death. I can read a man's shoulders better than I can read his eyes." He straightened up, shifting his grip from a horizontal sweep to a direct thrust, pointing the tip of his sword at my chest. "You aren't here to win," he said flatly. "You're here to take hits, aren't you?" I didn't answer, but my hand relaxed for a split second inside my sleeve. He had seen through everything. "I was in the crowd when you took that hit from Taizhan," he said. "The position, the angle, the depth, it was too perfect. You didn't fail to dodge. You calculated it. You wanted to trade your body for something. I don't know what you got out of it, but I won't give you a second chance." He raised his sword, pointing it directly at my right shoulder. "Your right hand is your trump card. You haven't used it once. You let Sun Xiaoyi swing 13 times without even trying to parry. You're not afraid of losing. You're afraid of showing your hand too early." He looked at me like I was a piece of equipment he was inspecting. "But you don't have another round. You have 2 choices, get knocked off this stage, or show me that hand." I still didn't speak. Slowly, I pulled my right hand out of my sleeve. The bandages were soaked with sweat and dried blood, but through the fabric, a very faint, shimmering glow began to pulse. Wang Dajiao saw the light. His grip on his sword tightened. It wasn't nerves, it was confirmation. This was what he wanted. He didn't say another word. He twisted his blade, his sword chi exploding outward. He lunged, aiming straight for my throat. He wasn't testing me anymore. The strike was twice as fast as before, the 6th-level energy whistling through the air. He didn't hold back. I didn't dodge. I pulled my left shoulder in and raised my right hand to meet the incoming light. The sword chi shredded the bandages on my palm instantly. As the fabric disintegrated, the glow erupted. My palm was almost completely exposed to the air. The 2-inch-long wound in my hand shimmered with a silver luster under the setting sun. I didn't try to grab my sword. Instead, I spread my fingers wide and pushed my bare hand directly toward Wang Dajiao's incoming blade. I pressed 3 fingers against the side of the steel, my thumb hooked over the spine, and my middle finger clamped down on the edge. I didn't try to block it head-on. That would have been suicide. Instead, I used the momentum of his own thrust, guiding the blade just a fraction of an inch away from its lethal path. The tip of the sword grazed my collarbone, slicing a shallow line into my skin, but I didn't flinch. My hand slid down the length of his blade like a snake until I reached the hilt. I locked my fingers around the crossguard and twisted with everything I had. The sword ripped out of Wang Dajiao's grip. It spun twice in the air before thudding into a crack in the stone tiles at the edge of the stage. The blade hummed, vibrating violently. The crowd below went silent. They hadn't even processed what happened. Wang Dajiao stood there, staring at his empty hand. It took him a few seconds to slowly lower his arm and look me in the eyes. "Your trump card isn't your right hand," he said quietly. I didn't say a word. "It's something inside your right hand." I didn't deny it. Wang Dajiao fell silent for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh. It was the look of a hunter who had just been bitten by a better prey and was begrudgingly admitting the other guy had sharper teeth. 130 years ago, he began, there was a man in the Qingyun sect who used a left-handed sword. Some say he betrayed the sect. Others say he was hunted down. There are a lot of stories. But everyone agreed on one thing. When he was alive, his talent for the sword was higher than the rest of the sect combined. He paused, staring deep into my eyes. "Your thing? It came from him, didn't it?" I didn't answer. I looked down at my right hand. The wound in my palm started throbbing again, but this time, I didn't try to suppress it. I looked back at him. What was his name? Wang Dajiao didn't answer. He turned away and walked toward the edge of the stage. He bent down, pulled his sword from the stone crack, and sheathed it with a sharp click. You win, he said. You passed the third round. He didn't look back as he walked away, his voice low but clear. But you should ask yourself, why? Why did he leave everything he had to you? Up in the stands, Su Qinwan stood up. A disciple next to him asked where he was going, but Su Qinwan didn't respond. He looked down at the jade pendant hanging from his waist. It was getting hotter, the warmth seeping through his clothes like a small furnace. He pressed his hand against the jade. Deep inside the stone, a tiny, almost invisible shape was glowing. It looked like a sword scar. He gripped the pendant tight and walked away from the arena. The crowd hadn't dispersed yet. Some were arguing about the fight. Others were cursing Wang Dajiao for being careless and walking off. Nobody noticed me. As soon as I got off the stage, I grabbed my right wrist with my left hand, squeezing it until my knuckles turned white. My whole arm was shaking. It wasn't fear, it was the backlash from using that white light. I hid my hand deep inside my sleeve and hurried toward the edge of the field. My shadow stretched into a thin line behind me in the twilight. I made it back to the East 8 courtyard. The moss in the small courtyard glowed with a damp light in the dusk. I stood in the center of the yard, hiding my trembling hand under my clothes, waiting for the vibrations to stop. The glow inside my palm finally went out. By the time the sun hit the horizon, the crowd around the arena had thinned out by half. I stood near the east side of the stage. My right hand hung limp at my side, my fingers curled into a half fist. I couldn't stand up straight, and I couldn't grip anything. Dried blood had glued the bandages to my skin, and every step I took felt like my flesh was being torn. My right arm was useless, filled with a dull, aching pain that radiated from my elbow to my fingertips. I couldn't even take a basic fighting stance. I just stood there. When Zheng Yin stepped onto the stage for the next round, the crowd went quiet. He wore a faded outer disciple uniform and carried an iron sword with 2 marks carved into the scabbard. He looked at my right hand. Blood was dripping from my fingertips, 1 drop at a time, forming a dark red puddle on the black stone. Zheng Yin stared at the blood for a few seconds, then looked up. You can't lift your right arm. I didn't answer. Zheng Yin unclipped the sword from his waist. The crowd started jeering. Fight! Stop wasting time. Kill him. But Zheng Yin didn't draw his blade. He held the sheathed sword horizontally and raised it toward the officials. I don't fight cripples. The crowd went dead silent. His right hand is finished, Zheng Yin said, his voice flat. He can barely stand. Winning wouldn't mean anything. He clipped the sword back to his waist and walked off the stage. He didn't look back. The official was stunned for a second before clearing his throat. Zheng Yin forfeits. Lin Yuan wins. The arena erupted. People were booing, laughing, or calling Zheng Yin a coward. He ignored them all, grabbed his coat from the edge of the stage, and disappeared into the crowd. I stood alone on the stage, looking down at the puddle of my own blood. It looked dark, almost black, under the dying sun. I tucked my hand further into my sleeve, but the stain on the stone remained. Every movement of my arm felt like a hot needle, but I didn't slow down. On the wall near the arena, a yellow paper had been posted. The ink was still wet. 5 names were on the list for those who made the cut. I was last. Zheng Yin was first. People around the board were whispering. Why did Zheng Yin forfeit? Who knows? Maybe he just thought his opponent was too pathetic. I stared at the name on the board for a moment, then turned and walked away. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. In the external affairs hall, an old steward in a gray robe flipped through a ledger and handed me a small iron plate. East 8 courtyard. Room 7. Single room. Don't lose the key. The iron was cold and the edges were worn smooth. The steward looked back down at his book. The courtyard next to yours has been empty for 3 years. Don't go wandering in there. Why is it empty? I asked. The steward glanced up at me, then looked back down. The last person who lived there died. It's been locked ever since. Just stay in your room and mind your own business. I didn't push it. I headed to the armory, where a middle-aged man was napping by the door. I handed him my iron plate. He blinked awake, grumbled, and pulled a thin booklet from a wooden shelf. He tossed it onto the table. Qingyun Basic Sword Techniques, he muttered. This is all you're allowed to practice for the first month. Don't get greedy. Master the first move before you even think about the second. If you can't stand steady, don't bother. I picked up the manual. It was light, covered in coarse blue-gray paper with frayed edges. The title was written in bold brushstrokes. I stared at the handwriting. I didn't open it immediately because I recognized the style. I had seen it last night. In the brief moment of silence before the voice in my head spoke, I had felt the shape of these words. The way the strokes turned, the way the brush lingered at the end of a line, it matched the blurry impressions in my mind. I flipped to the first page. First style, the standing sword. The main text was printed clearly, but next to it, there was a tiny note written in ink. Asterisk the waist and the brush are one. The sword isn't lifted, it is pushed, asterisk. The handwriting was messy and aggressive, with a distinctive hook at the end of every stroke. I closed the manual and tucked it under my arm. I said nothing. The East 8 courtyard was on the outer edge of the sect, near the back of the mountain. It wasn't big, just 4 rooms surrounding a small courtyard. The green moss on the stone floor seemed to glow in the fading light as I stepped inside. I hid my shaking hand under my clothes and stood in the silence, waiting for the world to stop trembling. In the wound of my palm, the silver light was completely gone. Room 7 was at the very end of the hallway. The lock was brand new, but when I pushed the door open, the air smelled stale, like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. I stepped inside, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. I pulled out the Qingyun basic sword techniques. I flipped past the first style and stopped at the second, the level thrust. The printed text was sparse. Only 3 lines explained the stance, the power delivery, and the recovery. It was almost too simple. But beneath the official text, there were more handwritten notes. The first line of notes matched the handwriting on the cover, messy, aggressive, and powerful. A thrust is not a poke, it read. Asterisk when you thrust, rotate the wrist half a turn. Let the blade twist inside the target. Asterisk. Otherwise, you're just making a hole. You aren't killing anything. The second line of notes was different. The ink was lighter, the strokes gentler. It only said 4 words. The body is the sheath. My breath hitched. My gaze locked onto those words, and something shifted deep in my mind. It felt like a heavy door in my memory had been nudged, though it didn't quite swing open. I pressed my finger against the ink. I could feel the slight ridges in the paper where the brush had been pushed down with immense force. Suddenly, the wound in my palm throbbed. It wasn't a pulse, it was a vibration. It felt as if something deep inside my flesh was resonating with the ink on the page. A faint, silver light flickered at the edge of the wound. It flashed once, then vanished. Then, a voice rang out in my head. 3 times left. I froze. That wasn't my thought. It was the voice of someone else, old, exhausted, sounding as if they had used their last ounce of strength to speak. I looked down at my right hand. The silver glow was gone. 3 times left. I didn't know why it was 3, or what would happen when those charges ran out. But I knew who that voice belonged to. Lu Jiyuan. I held my hand under the lamp to inspect the wound. It was smaller than it had been earlier that day. It wasn't healing in the normal sense. It was shrinking. The edges of the skin were drawing inward like a curtain being pulled shut. I pressed the edge of the wound with my left hand. It felt hard, like a thin, transparent film had formed over the surface. Underneath that film, something was alive. Something was still flowing. 3 times. The mark in my palm could be used 3 times. I had already used it once on the stage to summon that white light. That meant I had 2 left. What would happen after that? Would the mark vanish, or would that power be ripped out of me entirely? I didn't know. But Lu Jiyuan hadn't left this message to scare me. He was telling me to be careful. I had 3 chances, and I had to make every single one count. I clenched my right fist. A dull pain radiated through my palm. I repeated the number in my head. 2. Only 2 left. I closed the manual. The texture of those 4 words, the body is the sheath, seemed to linger on my fingertips. I stood up and pushed open the window. A cold night wind rushed in, carrying the scent of the pine forest from the back of the mountain. I looked down at the neighboring courtyard. It had been empty for 3 years. The gates were locked tight, and no light escaped the cracks in the shutters. The steward said the previous tenant had died. I hadn't asked who it was, but now the timing seemed too perfect. The time that courtyard became vacant matched the time Lu Jiyuan died. I didn't linger. I shut the window, but the number kept spinning in my mind. 2. In the villa next door, on the second floor, a window was cracked open. Su Qinwan stood in the shadows, her eyes fixed on the window of room 7. From her angle, she couldn't see me, but she could see the faint, steady glow of my lamp. She looked down at the jade pendant hanging from her waist. It was glowing with a soft, pale light. It had started shining the moment I stepped into the East 8 courtyard. She touched the surface of the jade. It was warm. "He's here," she whispered. The jade didn't answer. The light didn't flicker. It just stayed there, steady and dim, like a lonely lantern in the dark. She reached out and gently closed her window. The wood gave a tiny creak. In the distance, a night bird cried out, then went silent, as if something had cut it short. Back in my room, I was still sitting on the bed. The manual was open on my knees. My finger was still resting on those 4 words. I was starting to understand something, though I didn't dare believe it yet. Lu Jiyuan said there were 3 times left. 3 times for what? I had no answer. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't here by accident. Someone, or some sword, was waiting for me. The next morning, the sun barely touched the horizon. Birds chirped outside, and I could hear the sound of someone sweeping in the neighboring yard. I sat on my bed with the manual in front of me and my iron sword resting on my knees. It was a standard-issue disciple sword, thin, unsharpened, and light. I took a deep breath and reached out with my right hand. The moment my fingers touched the hilt, I felt it. It wasn't pain. It was emptiness. My fingers wouldn't curl. I wanted to grip it, but my index and middle fingers stopped halfway, as if there was a wall between my brain and my joints. I forced it. My fingers moved a fraction more, but the hilt wobbled in my palm. I couldn't get a solid grip. I tried adjusting my palm, pressing it flat against the leather wrap. Clang! The sword slipped through my fingers and hit the floor. I stared at it for a long time. I reached down with my left hand and picked it up. My left hand was steady, but it had no power. I hadn't trained it. I could hold the sword, but I couldn't aim it. I switched back to my right hand and tried again. It slipped. My knuckles just wouldn't bend far enough to lock around the hilt. When the sword pressed against the wound in my palm, a sharp sting made my temple throb. It slipped again. Footsteps echoed in the courtyard. Someone was walking past. I quickly hid the sword under my knees and kept my head down. Once the footsteps faded, I pulled it out and tried one more time. This time, I managed to hold it. I pressed the base of my thumb against the side of the hilt and curled my fingers into a half fist. It was like trying to hold onto a rope that was covered in grease. It looked ugly, but the sword stayed in my hand. I lifted it toward the morning light. I could hold it, but I couldn't swing it. It was my first day as an official disciple. We were told to gather at the training grounds. Only 5 of us had made the cut. Aside from me and Zheng Yan, there were 3 others, a tall guy and 2 quiet ones. The steward wasn't there. Instead, an older outer sect disciple was assigned to show us the ropes. He skimmed the list of names, stopping at the very last one. He looked up at me. "So, you're the one Zheng Yan let in?" he asked. Someone nearby snickered. I said nothing. The senior disciple shrugged. "Fine. Newbie rules. Everyone performs the first style once. It doesn't have to be perfect, just show me you know the moves." The tall guy went first. His movements were stiff, but his grip was solid. The 2 quiet guys followed. They were slower, but they held their swords correctly. Then it was my turn. I stood up, gripping the sword with my right hand, and walked to the center of the clearing. I moved into the starting position for the standing sword style. I held the blade vertically in front of my chest, stepped forward with my left foot, and dropped my center of gravity. I had practiced this in my head dozens of times last night. But my right hand wouldn't obey. Before I could even get the blade upright, my wrist began to shake. I tried to steady it, but my fingers acted on their own, loosening their grip. The blade tilted to the right, the tip carving a clumsy arc through the air, nearly stabbing my own knee. I reset and gripped it tighter. I tried again. The sword was still crooked. The senior disciple didn't say anything, but the tall guy couldn't help himself. "Is there something wrong with his right hand?" he muttered. The senior disciple watched me for a moment. He sighed. "Forget it. Try using your left hand instead." I switched the sword to my left hand. My grip was firm enough, but the transition from the first style to the second felt wrong. The power wasn't there. The blade stuttered in midair, like a heavy cart getting stuck on a steep hill. I didn't force it. I reset and went through the first style again. It was still crooked. I tried a third time, switching back to my right hand. The posture was ugly. The tip of the blade trembled. But I finished the movement. The sword didn't fall. The senior disciple didn't say a word. He just made a mark on his register and told us we were done. He sent us back to practice on our own. I turned and walked away. Blood was already soaking through the bandages on my right hand. The effort of the drill had torn the wound open again. I didn't look down. I just kept moving. Behind me, I heard the tall guy whispering. He wondered how someone with my skill level had managed to make it into the finals. No one answered him. Night fell. I didn't light a lamp. Moonlight spilled through the window, landing directly on the open manual. Those 4 words, body as the sheath, seemed to glow with a dull, dark light against the paper. The ink felt slightly raised, almost tactile. I sat on the edge of my bed and stared at them. I had been sitting there since dusk, doing nothing but watching those words. 3 times, I had tried to pick up the sword. Once with my right hand, twice with my left. Each time my palm touched the hilt, I felt a blockage. It was inside the wound on my right palm. It felt like a door that was stuck, neither fully open nor fully closed. When I put the sword down for the 3rd time, my eyes caught the wound on my palm. In the moonlight, it was giving off a very faint silver shimmer. It was actually glowing. It was weak, like the reflection of light on water at night. I stared at it for a long time before looking back at the manual on my knees. My gaze moved back and forth between the injury and the text. 3 times I looked, and then it clicked. It wasn't just understanding, it was a direct realization, like something had knocked on my mind from the inside. Body as the sheath. It didn't mean hiding a sword inside your body. It meant making your body the vessel for the sword. It meant letting the sword intent enter me, using my meridians as the scabbard and my wounds as the gateway. Those hidden injuries weren't just scars. They were pre-cut slots in the sheath. I used to think my ability was just about taking hits to steal techniques. I was wrong. My body was designed to be a living scabbard. Every injury that locked a technique away was a specific spot reserved for a specific style. I didn't need to learn them the traditional way. I just had to fit the technique into the corresponding wound. I looked at my right palm. That wound was one of the doors. It throbbed. It wasn't pain, it was a response. Something deep inside the injury was waking up, stirred by my realization. I slowly reached out and gripped the hilt again. This time, I didn't use force. I just pressed my palm against it, letting the wound touch the rough iron patterns of the grip. My fingers still wouldn't curl completely, but I didn't fight them. I let the hilt rest against the cut like a key sliding into a lock. My palm constricted. A wave of heat surged from the wound into my wrist. It climbed up the meridians of my arm, stopping only when it hit my shoulder. Then, the heat surged back down, circling through my arm before condensing into a sharp, tiny prick of pain in my palm. Then I felt it. Something was moving inside the wound. It wasn't a sword soul, but a finer, more subtle power. It felt like a signal triggered by the manual, tapping against my bone. I didn't let go. I tried to piece the signal together in my mind. It wasn't a full technique yet, but a phrase, or the beginning of a phrase that hadn't been finished. I had the edge of it, but I needed just a bit more to pull it out. I don't know how long I sat there. Suddenly, the sword intent inside me moved. It wasn't the power from the wound, but my own weak energy in my meridians. It started climbing up my spine. I froze. For 3 years as a servant, my meridians had been as dry as a desert. I couldn't hold a single drop of energy. The steward said I was a waste, that I'd never cultivate again. But now, that thread of energy was flowing. It was faint, but it was real. I stayed perfectly still, eyes closed, feeling the energy crawl through me. It was incredibly slow, getting stuck at every junction, like a tiny stream trying to cross parched earth. But it was moving. My palm jolted again. This time, the silver light spilled out from the edges of the wound. It climbed a short way up my arm and merged into my internal energy. My body shuddered as if something had expanded inside me. The first meridian was open. I had reached the first stage of body tempering. I opened my eyes and looked at my hand. The silver glow had faded, but my palm wasn't stiff anymore. I tried moving my fingers. My index and middle fingers curled normally. I gripped the sword tight. It stayed in my hand. In the neighboring courtyard, a second-story window was cracked open. Su Qinwan stood in the shadows, watching my window from across the gap. She looked down at the jade pendant on her waist. It was glowing again, brighter than it had been that morning. She touched the warm surface of the jade and looked back at my silhouette. She watched as I stood up with the sword. I didn't practice any moves. I just stood there, gripping the hilt, waiting. The jade pulsed once. She didn't make a sound, just watched me stand there in the dark for a long time. Inside the room, I could feel the door in my palm had opened a crack. The outline of the technique was there. I just needed to wait. It was coming soon. The next morning, the sun hit the courtyard and dried the dew on the bricks. I pushed my door open and saw a broken bamboo splinter on the windowsill. It hadn't been blown there by the wind. It was placed intentionally. The broken end pointed out, and the sharp tip pointed directly at my door. I looked at it, but didn't touch it. I glanced at the neighboring balcony, but the curtains were drawn. I turned and walked toward the martial grounds at my usual pace. Behind me, the splinter cast a long, thin shadow like a line connecting my door to the house next door. I found a quiet corner behind a high wall, overgrown with moss and littered with old stone weights. I stood in the center, gripping my iron sword with my left hand. I stepped forward into the first style. My movements were clunky. My left hand wasn't trained, and the power was all wrong. Would you like the summary of the next chapter? Every time I raised the sword vertically, my wrist would tilt outward. I didn't get frustrated. I just reset and started again. On the second try, I shifted my left hand down half an inch. The blade felt steadier, but it still leaned. By the third attempt, I slowed down completely. I stopped the sword right in front of my chest, focusing entirely on where the power was coming from in my left hand. I adjusted my grip, feeling the muscles tension, and finished the movement. I wasn't just practicing a technique. I was forcing my left hand to memorize every ounce of pressure and every point of exertion. It felt like 3 years ago, right after I woke up in this world, having to learn how to walk all over again. In the distance, the other new disciples were training on the main grounds. No one looked my way. Or rather, people saw me, but no one approached. An older disciple walked past the edge of the clearing and paused. He watched my stance for a moment, neither nodding in approval nor frowning in disgust. He just gave a small, neutral nod and kept walking. I didn't look up. I ran through the first style twice more, then moved to the second. My right arm hung limp at my side, my fingers curled into a half fist. I didn't use it. It wasn't that I couldn't move it at all, but I didn't want to waste a single chance. I needed to train my left hand in secret until it could fully replace my right. By the third time I performed the second style, the shaking in my arm finally began to fade. West of the training grounds, in a 2-story tea room, a window overlooked the courtyard. Su Qinwan sat there, a cup of untouched tea in front of her. Her gaze was fixed on my silhouette in the distance. She watched me using my left hand, repeating the basic first and second styles over and over. There was nothing flashy about it, just raw, repetitive discipline. She looked down at the jade pendant on her waist. It was glowing with a faint, steady light. It hadn't flickered or dimmed since I started practicing. She took a sip of her tea, stood up, and walked away from the window. Even as she left, the jade continued to glow. By the time I returned to my room, it was dark. I pushed the door open and paused. The bamboo splinter was still on the windowsill. The morning sun had been replaced by moonlight, casting a shadow that stretched across the floor. I stood in the doorway, staring at that small piece of wood. I could pick it up and put it in my pocket. That was a choice. Or I could ignore it and shut the window. That was another. I hesitated. I didn't move toward it, and I didn't close the window. I just stood there, watching its silhouette in the moonlight. The wound in my right palm throbbed. It wasn't pain. It was a pulse of recognition. It felt like something deep inside the cut was sensing something nearby. In the moonlight, a faint silver glow shimmered around the edges of the wound. "She's waiting for you," a voice whispered in my mind. It was low, as if afraid the neighbors would hear. "That splinter belongs to her. She's lived in that neighboring courtyard for 3 years. Who do you think she's been waiting for?" I remained silent for a long time. Waiting for me to do what? I don't know, the voice replied. I woke up only a few days before you did. But I know one thing. That jade pendant. I gave it to someone a long time ago. I looked down at my palm. The silver light was pulsing like a breathing lamp. I looked back at the splinter on the windowsill. I reached out, but I didn't take it. I simply closed the window, leaving the splinter outside in the cold. Late into the night, a light stayed on in the second-story window of the house next door. Through a gap in the curtains, I could see a figure sitting perfectly still under the lamp. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened the Qingyun basic sword techniques. I turned to the second style. The words "use the body as a portal" seemed to shimmer in the dim light. I placed my right palm over the ink. My wound began to throb again. This time, it wasn't a random vibration. It was rhythmic, like a heartbeat, but slower. Something was waking up. Then I heard it. It wasn't a sound for my ears. It was a vibration coming from the bones of my hand. It was a high, thin ringing, like a wire stretched tight in the wind. A sword hum. It wasn't my physical sword making the noise. It was the sword's soul fragment inside my wound. It was responding to something. I looked toward the window. The light next door was still burning like a candle that refused to go out. I opened my palm. The silver glow was no longer a blur. It was condensing. Deep inside the wound, a shape was emerging. It was faint and incomplete, like a sketch waiting for the final stroke, but I could see it clearly now. It was the shape of a sword. It was thin, elegant, and missing just one last detail. I didn't rush it. I just watched it grow inside me like a seed finally sprouting. I closed the manual, but kept my lamp burning. I leaned against the wall, my palm glowing in the dark, an unfinished signal to the world outside. The third morning arrived with the scent of dew and moss. I pushed my door open. The bamboo splinter was still there, unmoved, covered in a fine layer of mist. I still didn't touch it. I checked my palm. In the bright morning light, the silver glow was almost invisible until I stepped into the shadows. The outline was sharper today. A thin line of light moved under my skin, tracing the length of a long, slender blade. But the tip was still missing. It was like a painting that stopped right at the climax. I touched the outline with my left finger. No reaction. I held my palm up to the sun, waiting for the light to finish the drawing for me, but nothing changed. I pulled my sleeve down to hide the glow and headed to the martial grounds. It was my third day of training with my left hand. First style. Second style. Repeat. A faint sense of momentum was building. It wasn't mastery yet, but my body was starting to remember the angles. I didn't have to visualize every movement in my head anymore. I tried linking the first and second styles together. The blade carved a continuous arc through the air without a pause. I stopped and looked at my left hand. Then, I tried switching the sword to my right. The moment my right hand gripped the hilt, my wound contracted violently. A sharp, stinging pain shot up my wrist. It wasn't unbearable, but it was enough to make me drop the sword. The silver light flickered at the sight of the pain. It wasn't a warning, it was a rejection. My right hand wasn't ready. I switched the sword back to my left and started the first style again. The older disciple didn't pass by today. It was just me and my shadow in the clearing. To the north stood the library pavilion, an old wooden building where the real secrets were kept. I knew my next step was there. The paint on the doors and windows was peeling. The wooden planks on the steps were worn thin and sagging from years of heavy footsteps. I had been assigned to the library pavilion to transcribe basic cultivation manuals. It was standard busy work for new disciples, a way to keep us useful while we learned the ropes. I sat at a wooden table in a corner of the first floor. An old book with curled edges lay open in front of me. I spent half an hour dipping my brush and scratching characters onto paper until my wrist started to ache. I set the brush down and stretched, looking around. The stone walls were lined with rows of wooden shelves. Most of the scrolls were yellowed with age. In the far corner, I spotted a messy pile of books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. They were thick with dust. I stood up and walked over, crouching down to flip through them. Most were fragmented manuals or discarded cultivation notes. The handwriting was messy and hard to read. But when I reached the third book, a loose page slid out from between the leaves. It was yellowed and the edges were curled. The creases were so worn they looked ready to snap. It wasn't bound to the book. It had been tucked inside like a bookmark. I picked it up and turned it over. There was only half a line of text written in a light, careful hand. It looked like the writer was afraid of being seen. The sword embryo takes shape, only missing one. The rest was torn off. The edge was a clean cut, made by a blade rather than a natural tear. The sword embryo. Those words matched exactly what Lu Jiyuan had told me. And the phrase missing one lined up perfectly with the silver sword outline in my palm, the one that was missing its final stroke. I flipped the paper over. The back was blank, but as I held it up, I saw a faint indentation in the fibers. Someone had pressed down hard while writing on the page above this one. It wasn't ink, just a ghost of a mark. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my sleeve. I put the books back exactly as I found them and returned to my desk. I wrote 3 more lines of the manual, then paused. On a scrap piece of paper, I wrote 4 words that weren't in the text. Missing one of what? I stared at the words for a moment, then flipped the paper over to hide them. By dusk, I was walking back to the East 8 courtyard with a finished scroll in my hand. Low hedges lined the path. The evening light was soft, stretching my shadow out long across the stone. Halfway down the walkway, I caught a movement in my peripheral vision. Someone was standing under the corridor eaves. It was Su Qinwan. He was leaning against a pillar in a light gray robe, no weapon at his side. He looked like he was just taking a stroll, but he was positioned perfectly to see anyone coming down the path. I didn't stop. I kept walking, closing the distance from 20 paces to 10. Su Qinwan didn't look away. His gaze moved from my face down to my right hand, which was gripping the scroll. My fingers were curved naturally now, no longer clenched in that stiff, half fist I'd been forced to hold. As I passed directly in front of him, I gave a tiny nod. It wasn't a greeting. It was a confirmation. I see you. Su Qinwan didn't respond. He didn't nod, didn't smile, didn't show a single flicker of emotion. I walked past him without looking back. He stayed there, motionless, until my footsteps faded into the distance. Only then did he look down at the jade pendant on his waist. The glow was brighter than it had been that morning. Late that night, I sat on the edge of my bed by lamplight. I pulled out the scrap of paper from the library and looked at that sentence again. The sword embryo takes shape, only missing one. I picked up a pen and began to mimic the handwriting on the margin. I needed to be sure of something. As soon as I started, I realized the style was steady and decisive despite the light touch. It wasn't the powerful, weathered stroke of Lu Jiyuan. It was elegant and clear, like bamboo leaves after rain. It was a woman's handwriting. I turned the paper over and held it up to the lamp. I let the light bleed through the fibers, searching for the outline of that indentation. Slowly, the shape emerged. It wasn't a word. It was a drawing. The lines were simple, a sword without a sheath. It was slender with a slightly curved tip and a distinct notch at the hilt. It was an exact match for the silver mark under my skin. My breath hitched. I lowered the paper and opened my right palm. The silver light was glowing faintly in the dim room, still missing that final stroke at the tip. I looked at the paper, then at my hand. They were identical, right down to the missing piece. Then, next to the drawing on the back of the paper, I saw 2 more words written in that same elegant hand. Waiting for you. The moment I read them, the wound in my palm throbbed violently. It wasn't pain. It was a surge of heat that rushed from the wound and flooded my entire arm. The silver light in my palm flared. It wasn't flickering anymore. It was steady and solid, like a lamp being lit. On the paper, the drawing of the small sword seemed to complete itself. In my palm, the final stroke of the silver outline closed silently. The sword was whole. I sat in the silence for a long time, staring at my hand. The silver mark glowed against my skin like a blade fresh from the forge, waiting for me to pick it up. Outside, the lights in the neighboring courtyard were still on. I said nothing. I folded the paper, tucked it under the cover of my sword manual, and closed the book. The mark in my palm continued to glow. Just before dawn, during the darkest hour, I snapped my eyes open. No noise had woken me. It was a vibration in my right hand, like the faint flutter of wings inside my skin. I sat up and opened my palm. The sword mark was vivid and sharp now, looking less like a glow and more like a needle-thin blade embedded in my flesh. It was beautiful and lethal. I stared at it, wondering if I could use it. I focused my mind on my palm, trying to push the energy out. Nothing. I tried again, imagining the blade extending from my hand. Still nothing. The silver light was blindingly bright, but it gave me no power. It was like a masterpiece sword hanging on a wall, sharp to the eye, but useless until drawn. I reached out and grabbed the iron sword by my bed. I gripped the hilt with my right hand. There was no stinging pain this time. The moment my skin touched the hilt, the silver light flowed out of my wound like water. It raced up the metal, coating the entire blade in a thin, shimmering film. It wasn't blinding. It looked like moonlight reflecting off a lake. I swung. The sword left a silver trail in the air, a slender arc of light that hung in the darkness for a heartbeat before fading. I looked down at the weapon. The silver had receded, leaving behind the same ordinary iron blade. But I had seen the trail. I knew it was real. I checked my palm. The mark was still there, glowing just as brightly as before. I didn't try a second time. I put the sword down and waited for the morning. Dawn broke over the East 8 courtyard. I practiced the first and second forms of the basic techniques using my left hand. My movements were smoother than they had been 2 days ago. I was still a bit stiff, but I no longer had to stop and recalibrate my position in my head after every swing. I didn't notice the group of people watching me from the edge of the martial arts field. One outer disciple leaned in close to his companion, his voice a low whisper. "I saw it yesterday," he said, a flash of light on his sword. It was silver, not a reflection from the sun. The other man followed his gaze. I was standing there with my head down, focused on my training. My left hand held the sword with disciplined, standard movements. There was nothing unusual about the blade. "You must have seen it wrong," the companion replied. "I didn't," the first man insisted. A tall disciple walked over. He was the same one who had questioned whether my right arm was useless on the first day. He stood at the edge of the clearing, watching me practice for a long time. I didn't look up. I finished the first form and moved immediately into the second. My left-handed form was perfect. There wasn't a single wasted movement. The tall disciple stared at me for 10 breaths. Then he stepped forward. "Lin Yuan," he called out. "Let me see you perform the third form." I stopped. I knew this wasn't an official test. He was probing me. I didn't say a word. I simply switched the sword to my right hand. I moved slowly. I wanted everyone to see how much I was struggling. My fingers wouldn't curl all the way around the hilt. My grip was awkward and weak. I began the third form with my right hand. My posture was crooked. The tip of my sword was off by half an inch. It looked terrible. When I finished, I switched the sword back to my left hand and returned to my original stance. The tall disciple looked at my clumsy performance and stayed silent for a moment. Then he turned and walked away. The other disciples followed him without a word. I stood my ground. Only when their footsteps faded did I glance at my right palm. The silver glow was still there, resting quietly beneath my skin. I pulled down my sleeve and went back to practicing the first form with my left hand. That afternoon, I took a shortcut through the library. I went straight to the pile of discarded books I had found the day before. I knelt and started flipping through them one by one. Most were useless, incomplete manuals, discarded notes, and tattered records. I shook each one, checking for hidden pages, before putting them back. At the very bottom, my fingers brushed against a thin booklet without a cover. The paper was coarse. The front was blank. I flipped through it. The first page was empty. So was the second. But when I reached the third, a loose sheet of paper slid out from between the pages. This paper was newer than the scrap I'd found yesterday. It wasn't yellowed, and the creases were shallow. It looked like someone had tucked it in there recently. I turned it over. There were no words, only a drawing. It was a simple ink sketch, but the strokes were masterful. It showed a figure holding a sword. The body was turned sideways, the center of gravity pressed low. The right hand held the sword, pointing it diagonally toward the ground. The blade was almost touching the floor. This wasn't any of the basic forms of the Qingyan sect. I flipped the paper over. On the back, there was a single line of small text. The handwriting was different from the scrap I'd found before. It was sharp and powerful. "This is a sword technique," the note read. "It is not meant to be practiced in front of others." I stared at the words for a long time. I folded the paper carefully and tucked it into my sleeve. I put the books back exactly as I'd found them and sat at a wooden table to continue my transcriptions. After 15 minutes, I checked the window. The coast was clear. I took the paper out, memorized the drawing one last time, and hid it under the cover of my notebook. Late that night, I found an abandoned woodshed in the deepest corner of the East 8 courtyard. The door was loose and the lock was broken. I had noted its location earlier that day. I pushed the door open. Inside were stacks of dry firewood and a broken table. Moonlight filtered through a hole in the roof, casting a narrow beam of light on the floor. I stood in the moonlight and gripped my sword with my right hand. There was no stinging pain this time. Instead, my palm felt warm. It wasn't a rejection of the power, it was a connection. It felt like a secret understanding between the hilt and my hand. I closed my eyes and visualized the drawing. Sideways stance, gravity low, sword pointed down. I opened my eyes and executed the first strike. There was no glow, no special effect. It was just a plain horizontal slash, cutting diagonally from the bottom right to the top left. The angle was strange. It didn't look like any basic technique I'd ever seen. It didn't even look like a normal attack. But as soon as I finished the strike, my body moved on its own. It was an automatic recovery move I hadn't even thought of. My muscles were completing the sequence for me. I stopped and reset. I tried it again. The second time was smoother. The transition between the strike and the recovery became a single, fluid arc. I tried a third time. This time, the blade sliced through the air with a faint, sharp whistle. It was a short sound, like wind rushing through a narrow crack. It echoed in the empty shed for less than a heartbeat. I stopped and looked at the sword. The iron hadn't changed, but the silver light in my palm had dimmed slightly. I lowered the weapon and stood in the moonlight for a long time. When I got back to my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened my palm. The sword mark was no longer glowing. The silver light was gone. I could still see the outline of the blade under my skin, but it was dark, like a light bulb that had been switched off. You used it once, a voice whispered in my mind. It sounded calm, but tired. The complete mark can only be used 3 times. That was the first. You have 2 left. What happens when I use them all? I asked. There was a long silence. I don't know. I never used it 3 times. Neither did the previous owner. Does it disappear? Not disappear. It gets exhausted. It will turn back into the wound you had when you first found it. If you want to condense it again, you'll have to start from the beginning. I didn't ask anything else. I pulled my sleeve down. I looked out the window. The second-floor window of the neighboring courtyard was dark tonight. No lamp. It sat there in the shadows like a candle that had been blown out long ago. I didn't see the figure standing in the darkness behind that window. They had extinguished their light the moment the glow in my palm appeared. It wasn't a coincidence. I tucked the drawing under my pillow and leaned against the wall. I didn't blow out my lamp, and I didn't lie down. The dim mark in my palm was almost invisible now. The next morning, I woke up and immediately checked my hand. The mark was still there, but it had changed. It was fading. The outline was still there, like an ink drawing that had lost its color. The silver light had retreated deep into my skin. I tried to summon the energy. The silver flashed for a fraction of a second and died. I tried again. It was even shorter. 2 left, the voice said. It was even fainter than yesterday. Use them wisely. I looked down at the faded mark embedded in my skin. What would happen when it was gone? I didn't have an answer. Silence. Lu Jiyuan didn't answer me. I waited for a few breaths, but when the silence stretched on, I stopped asking. I pulled my sleeve down to hide the mark, stood up, and pushed open the door. Morning light flooded the room, smelling of fresh dew. I stepped outside and paused by the windowsill. The bamboo stick was still there, but 2 dried water spots now marked its surface. They weren't from the morning dew. It was too early for that to have settled. I made my way to the open clearing in the East 8 courtyard. The tall disciple from yesterday wasn't there. Instead, a stranger stood at the edge of the martial grounds, head down, focused on adjusting the grip wrap on his sword hilt. He looked up at me briefly, a neutral, passing glance, and went back to his work. I walked to the center of the clearing and began practicing the first form of the sword technique with my left hand. I practiced for half an hour. No one approached me. No one questioned my clumsy movements or tried to test my strength. The other disciple finished his task and left. People passed by in the distance, but no one stopped. I stood there alone, my left hand gripping the sword, surrounded by a circle of heavy silence. After finishing the second form for the 3rd time, I looked toward the main martial grounds. Disciples stood in small groups, talking and laughing. There was a physical gap between my spot and theirs, a distance no one bothered to cross. I wasn't being bullied, but I wasn't being accepted either. I was in a state of suspension, a ghost they hadn't decided how to deal with yet. I lowered my sword. I didn't look at them again and went back to the first form. During the lunch break, I waited until the grounds were empty and slipped back into the abandoned woodshed. I pulled the folded sword manual page from my sleeve. The creases were turning white from being handled so much. I stood in a shaft of moonlight filtering through the roof and took the opening stance shown in the drawing. I lowered my center of gravity and pointed my sword diagonally toward the ground with my right hand. I held the pose, then channeled the energy into the mark on my palm. The silver glow flashed for a second. It didn't spread to the iron sword this time. Instead, the drawing on the paper changed. It wasn't a physical shift, but more like an optical illusion that becomes clearer the longer you stare. The figure on the page shifted from a forehand grip to a backhand. The sword tip moved from pointing at the ground to pointing behind the body. The weight shifted from the left foot to the right. I blinked, stunned. I adjusted my position to match the change. Backhand grip, blade pressed against the outside of my right arm, weight heavy on my right foot. The moment I hit the pose, a hidden scar on the inside of my right arm began to burn. It wasn't painful, it was heat, a steady, glowing warmth, like a lamp being lit in a dark room. I looked down at my arm. My sleeve hid the spot, but I knew exactly where it was, 3 inches below the collarbone. It was the third scar I had counted when I first discovered the 300 marks on my body. I didn't swing the sword. I just stood there, feeling the temperature of that hidden wound. It slowly cooled, but the warmth remained deep inside. I folded the paper and tucked it away, thinking for a long time. By evening, the setting sun painted the bricks of the courtyard a warm yellow. I stopped at the entrance to my quarters. The window of the neighboring house was cracked open tonight, just a sliver, about 2 fingers wide. I couldn't see if anyone was inside. On the windowsill, the bamboo stick was still there, but a new object sat beside it, a single holly leaf. It was deep green, perfectly intact, with no signs of wilting. It sat half on the edge of the sill, half hanging off. It hadn't been blown there by the wind. The wind would have tossed it to the ground or into a corner. Someone had placed it there, precisely on the edge. I stood 3 paces away, staring at the leaf and the stick for a few seconds. I didn't touch them. I pushed open the door to room 7, went inside, and lit my lamp. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I spread my right palm. The sword mark was almost invisible under the lamplight. I could only see the outline if I tilted my hand to let the shadows fall across it. I tried to summon it with my mind. A faint silver spark flickered deep inside, weaker than this morning, like the final jump of a dying candle flame. "Senior?" I whispered. No response. I waited. "Senior?" Still nothing. My palm remained silent. The dim mark lay under my skin like an extinguished lamp. I looked at my hand and realized something. I had thought the sword mark was a gift of power from Lu Jiyuan, but the mark and his voice were tied together. Every time the mark glowed, he grew weaker. I had used it once, and his voice became a whisper. If I used it again, I might never hear him again. I didn't try to summon the light again. I balled my hand into a fist. A final spark of silver flashed between my fingers and then went completely dark. Outside, in the house next door, the faint line of light from the cracked window vanished at the exact moment I closed my hand. Both rooms fell into total darkness. On the morning of the 6th day, I woke with my right hand still clenched. I had been holding it so tight in my sleep that my knuckles were white, as if I were grasping something in a dream. I relaxed my fingers. The sword mark was still there, but it looked like a gray smudge left behind by a burnt talisman. It didn't glow. It didn't pulse. I sat up and held my hand in the morning light. Nothing. Then I remembered the very first thing Lu Jiyuan had told me. It wasn't the long explanation about the sword techniques. It was something he said the night I pricked my palm with the iron needle. I hadn't paid much attention then, but now I realized it was the core of everything. Every scar on your body is an aperture. I sat on the edge of the bed and slowly pulled off my shirt. I walked to the corner where a cracked, rusty bronze mirror stood. It was blurry and pitted, but clear enough for what I needed. I turned so the morning light hit my body. My back, my arms, my chest, my ribs. 300 hidden scars crisscrossed my skin like a piece of paper that had been written on and erased 1,000 times. Every mark was a piece of history I couldn't remember. I used to think the secret was just about taking hits and stealing techniques. But I saw it clearly now. Every scar was a scabbard. Waterbreaker was just one of the swords. The technique I stole from Zhao Tieshan's blade had simply activated one of the sword intents nurtured within those wounds. What else was hidden in the other 299 scars? The 3 chances from the sword tip in my palm and the sword intent in these scars were 2 different things. Even if the 3 chances were gone, the tip remained. It just wouldn't lend me its strength anymore. But the swords inside my scars belonged to me. If I could pull them out, they didn't cost a thing. I pressed my hand against the most prominent scar below my collarbone. I felt a very faint pulse beneath the skin. It didn't match my heartbeat. There was something inside that wound. I lowered my hand and put my clothes back on, repeating that one sentence over and over in my head. Every scar was an aperture. I pushed my door open and walked toward the abandoned woodshed. Once inside, I shut the door tight, cutting off the world. There was a small hole in the wall letting in a beam of morning light, so I blocked it with a piece of old cloth. The room plunged into darkness. I stood there, eyes closed. I didn't reach for a physical sword. Instead, I let my consciousness sink deep into my own body. I wasn't trying to activate the sword mark in my palm this time. I was looking inward. I followed the flow of my meridians, starting from my right shoulder and moving down. I passed my chest, my ribs, and my waist. It was like walking down a familiar road marked with old signs. Every hidden scar inside me glowed like a dim lamp. They weren't bright, but I could feel exactly where they were. I focused my mind on the inside of my left arm, specifically the second hidden scar. This one was deeper than the one that held the waterbreaker technique. I remembered how it felt when I touched it while changing my clothes. The white mark was longer than the others, its edges jagged and irregular. It wasn't a clean cut from a blade. It felt like I'd been torn open by something serrated, like a hooked dildo or a jagged spear. I let my mind sink into it. Deep within that wound, I felt a completely different sword intent. It wasn't sharp or decisive like Waterbreaker. It didn't have that one-hit kill aura. This one felt heavy, slow. It felt like a massive piece of iron that had been soaking in deep water for 100 years. You didn't use this to slice. You used it to crush. Waterbreaker was a saber. This intent was a heavy broadsword. I tried to grasp it. Just like I had triggered the sword mark before, I reached out with my will, trying to establish a connection. The sword intent shuddered. It felt like a sleeping animal sensing a human touch. It rolled over, shifting its weight, and then nothing. It didn't respond. It just vibrated once and went back to its deep, silent sleep. I tried 3 more times. Every time, the result was the same. I could feel it. I could touch it, but I couldn't pull it out. The sword was too heavy. With my current cultivation, no, with the current state of my broken body, I wasn't strong enough to draw this second blade from its scar. I opened my eyes and stood in the dark shed. My breathing was steady. I wasn't frustrated. I simply memorized the weight and shape of that intent. Short, wide, and heavy. A one-handed war sword. I pushed the door open and walked back out into the light. A steward disciple was waiting at the edge of the clearing, flipping through a thin ledger. According to the rules, any disciple who had been in the sect for 7 days had to complete a labor mission. Cleaning out the spirit beast nests in the back mountains, the steward announced. We leave in 3 days. I'll read the names. I was the 3rd name called. I looked at the 2 men I'd be traveling with. One was a silent saber cultivator. A short, dull blade hung at his waist, its scabbard worn and the hilt wrapped in fading blue cloth. He wasn't tall, but his shoulders were incredibly broad. He stood there like a silent stone wall. The other was tall and thin. He was a talker. As soon as the steward finished, the thin guy turned and sized me up. He smirked, not with malice, but with a total lack of respect. So, you're the one Zheng Yin let through, he said. I didn't say a word. Fine, he shrugged. It's just a cleaning job anyway. We don't expect you to actually kill anything. Just stay back so you don't get scratched. The silent saber cultivator didn't join in. He didn't even look at me. He just adjusted his blade and walked away. The thin guy followed, leaving me alone. I watched them disappear, then looked down at my right hand. The faint sword mark lay hidden beneath my sleeve. 3 days. I had 3 days before the mission to pull that second sword intent out of my scar. I had already used Waterbreaker on the stage. People would recognize it. I needed something new. By evening, I returned to the East 8 courtyard. The sun hadn't fully set. I stopped at the entrance. The window of the neighboring room, the dead man's room, was closed. It wasn't just cracked open like yesterday. It was shut, but not tightly. A tiny sliver remained, like an eyelid that hadn't quite closed all the way. I looked down at the windowsill. The bamboo stick was gone. The holly leaf was gone. The stone had been wiped clean, and the edges were still damp, as if someone had just used a wet cloth. Only one thing remained on the sill. It was a tiny fragment. It was milky white with jagged edges, looking like a corner snapped off something larger. In the fading sunlight, it gave off a warm, soft glow. It wasn't the shine of a rock. It was the luster of jade. A fragment of a jade pendant. I stood there for a long time, staring at it. I didn't reach out to take it. Instead, I turned and pushed open the door to my own room, room 7. But I didn't go inside immediately. I paused at the doorway, reached over, and pushed my own window open just a crack. I left it exactly as wide as the gap in the window next door. Then I went inside and shut the door. Outside, the jade fragment sat quietly between the 2 rooms. 2 neighboring windows, both peering into the twilight through identical cracks. Night fell. I lit a lamp and sat on the edge of my bed. I opened my right palm. The sword mark was almost invisible under the lamplight, but I knew it was there. I needed a weapon for this mission. I couldn't use Waterbreaker. I had to get that second sword out. I closed my eyes and sank back into the scar on my left arm. That heavy, broad presence was still there, like an iron beast sleeping underwater. I tried to grab it again. It shuddered, but wouldn't budge. I stopped. I needed a different way. Instead of pulling, I decided to reverse the logic of my body as a scabbard technique. A scabbard isn't just for holding a sword. It's for letting the sword go. I didn't try to grab the intent this time. I opened a door for it. I cleared a path through my meridians, stretching from the scar all the way to my fingertips. I created a channel, like a path leading a trapped fish to the surface. I waited. Then I felt it. The heavy sword intent moved on its own. It wasn't being pulled, it was letting go. My scar suddenly burned with heat. A silver light emerged from the wound on my left arm, not my palm. It slid down my arm, through my elbow, past my wrist, and finally condensed into an inch of glowing light at my fingertip. Short, wide, heavy, the shape of the war sword. It flickered there for a second, like a frost flower made of breath, and then went out. I looked at my finger. The residual heat was still there, like the touch of a hand that had just let go. I wasn't discouraged. 3 days. I had 3 days. I clenched my fist, closed my eyes, and dove back into the scar. This time, I wasn't letting go. Chapter 12, Drawing the Sword. The 7th day arrived. The day of the labor mission. At dawn, I stood at the entrance of the East 8 courtyard. A standard-issue iron sword was tucked into my waist. It wasn't sharpened and weighed less than 3 pounds. My left hand hung at my side, and my right hand was tucked into my sleeve. The saber cultivator was already there, leaning against the wall in silence. The blue cloth on his hilt was frayed. He glanced at me, didn't say hello, and looked away. I'd heard his name mentioned before. Chen Hung. He'd been in the sect for 6 months, but no one knew where he came from. Some said he was a former mine guard, like Xiao Taizhan. Others said he didn't fit that mold. I didn't know which was true. But as I walked up, Chen Hung tilted his head slightly. He wasn't looking at my face. He was looking at my left hand, the hand I was using to grip my sword. The tall, thin guy was the last to show up. He was still tying his belt as he walked, a half-eaten dry biscuit hanging out of his mouth. "All right," he mumbled through the food. "Let's get moving." "Just the 3 of us?" Chen Hing asked, his voice flat. "I thought this was a 5-man team." The tall, thin guy, Shou, spat out a stray crumb from his biscuit and wiped his hands on his pants. "The others took different missions. It's just us." He turned his gaze toward me, scanning me from head to toe with a look of pure doubt. "Fine. Whatever. Chen Hung is the primary attacker. You, kid, just stand where we tell you. Don't drag us down." I didn't say a word. Neither did Chen Hung. He simply turned and started walking toward the back mountain. I followed behind him. As we passed the entrance of the East 8 courtyard, I paused for a split second to look back. The fragment of the jade pendant was still sitting there on the windowsill of the neighboring courtyard. The morning light hit it, giving it a warm, milky white glow. It hadn't been touched. I stared at it for 2 heartbeats, memorizing the exact spot, then turned away and followed my teammates into the mountain path. The further we went, the more isolated it became. Once we left the sect's maintained boundaries, the dirt road vanished, replaced by steep slopes of loose gravel. The brush grew thick on both sides, and the canopy above knit together until most of the sunlight was choked out. We walked for about half an hour in total silence. Sho occasionally kicked a stone out of boredom, while Chun-Hung led the way with a quiet, focused intensity. Suddenly, Chun-Hung stopped and crouched down at a fork in the path. There were claw marks embedded deep in the dirt. The edges were dry and hard, but the shape was unmistakable. 5 parallel trenches, each as thick as a pinky finger. Chun-Hung measured the span with his hand, and his voice dropped an octave. "This isn't a low-level beast." Sho leaned in to look, and his face went pale. "This looks way bigger than what the intelligence report said." "The report said 3 low-level beasts," Chun-Hung muttered. "Based on this size, one of these things is worth 3 of them." No one replied. I stood behind them, keeping my thoughts to myself. But ever since we entered this area, the hidden injury on the inside of my left arm, the one I'd felt back in the woodshed, had started to heat up. It wasn't a sharp pain. It was a steady, low-frequency pulse, like a heartbeat. It felt like something was waiting for me up ahead. I pulled my sleeve down to hide my arm and kept pace with the team. The entrance to the cave was tucked under a low rock wall, half hidden by thick, hanging vines. The opening was about as tall as a man, and the light died instantly just a few feet inside. Chun-Hing stopped at the mouth of the cave, tilting his head to listen. Silence. He unsheathed his short blade and signaled for Sho to stay close. I took the rear. We had only taken 2 steps inside when the vines above us shifted. It wasn't the wind. 3 beasts lunged down from the rock face above the entrance. They hadn't been hiding inside the cave. They were clinging to the wall directly over our heads like upside-down spiders, waiting for us to walk underneath them. Sho was in the lead, and his reaction was a split second too slow. As one beast dove at him, he didn't have time to draw his weapon. He twisted his body to dodge, but the creature's claws ripped through his leg. "Damn it!" Sho cursed, blood immediately soaking through his pants. Chun-Hing reacted instantly. He spun and swung his blade, catching the beast's forelimb and forcing it back. But the other 2 were already flanking him. He was one man trying to hold off 3 monsters. The sounds of metal clashing against razor-sharp claws echoed through the cave mouth. "Lin Yuan, do something, you idiot." Chun-Hung barked, his voice tight and urgent. My right hand gripped the hilt of my iron sword. I started to pull it, but halfway through the motion, I felt it. The sword-shaped mark in my palm was cold. Water breaker. I couldn't use it. That was a move I had stolen from Zhao Tieshan's blade, a fleeting spark that had already vanished from my mind. My body had forgotten the rhythm. I had to use my left hand. I switched my grip, but I'd only been practicing left-handed swordsmanship for 4 days. I hadn't even mastered the first stance, let alone a real fight. Before I could even raise the blade, the 3rd beast slammed into my side. I didn't have time to dodge. The impact sent me crashing to the ground, my back hitting the jagged rock wall. The iron sword flew out of my hand, clattering into the darkness. I lay there on the gravel, the dust stinging my throat, listening to Sho's cursing and the whistle of Chun-Hing's blade. My body's instincts took over. As I hit the ground, my right hand landed flat against the earth. The moment my palm touched the dirt, that dim sword shape inside my hand suddenly flared. It didn't glow, it burned. It felt like a stone that had been held in a fire for hours. Before I could even think, my body moved. I rolled, using my right hand to push myself up. I didn't reach for my fallen iron sword. Instead, I reached for the hidden injury on the inside of my left arm. I didn't use my will. I just pressed my fingers against the scar. The injury split open. Not physically, but a silver light erupted from deep within the wound. It didn't come from my palm. It flowed from that white scar on my inner arm like a rushing stream, surging through my veins, past my elbow, through my wrist, and into my right hand. A solid, heavy shadow of a sword appeared in my grip. It wasn't iron, it was condensed silver light. Short, wide, heavy. It was the exact shape of the war sword I had sensed within the scar. I didn't hesitate. I gripped the silver hilt, spun, and delivered a backhanded horizontal slash. The silver light traced a perfect arc through the air. The blade met the forelimb of the beast lunging at me. It didn't just chop, it sliced. It was so sharp that it passed through bone with zero resistance. The beast's limb was severed cleanly. The cut was so smooth the blood hadn't even started to spray yet. The creature let out a short, choked shriek and collapsed, twitching on the ground until it went still. Chun-Hung and Shou both saw it. Chun-Heng's blade paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes locking onto the glowing silver sword before he forced himself to look away. He didn't ask. Shou just stood there, his mouth hanging open, unable to make a sound. I looked down at my right hand. The silver sword was stable, radiating a cold, calm light. It felt like I was holding a piece of forged moonlight. I thought it would only last a second, but it stayed. The blade hummed softly, like a living thing opening its eyes for the first time. I realized then, this wasn't the first time I had drawn this weapon. This body had held this sword before. I didn't know what battle it had seen, or who it had killed, or what had happened afterward. But my hand knew how to hold it. My wrist knew the angle of the strike. This sword was alive. Out of the 300 hidden injuries in my body, this was the first one I had truly claimed as my own. It didn't belong to the sect or anyone else. It was mine. I stood at the threshold of the cave, where the light met the dark, the silver glow illuminating my face. From deep within the shadows of the cavern, a low growl drifted up. It wasn't the sound of the three small beasts. It was deeper, heavier. It sounded like a massive creature stirring, its lungs churning the thick air. I didn't step back. I gripped the silver sword and was the first to walk into the darkness. I looked down at the iron sword in my left hand. The edge was curled, and a deep notch had been bitten into the blade where I had smashed it against the beast's skull. The weapon was trash now. I opened my fingers and let it drop. The sound of metal clattering against stone echoed through the mouth of the cave. Chun-Hung didn't ask any questions. He pulled a spare short blade from his waist, not his primary weapon, but the steel was clean even if the sheath was worn. He handed it to me without a word. I took it, testing the weight. It was lighter than the iron sword but balanced toward the tip, making it perfect for hacking and slashing. I gave it a quick flick to get a feel for the center of gravity. Shou was leaning against the jagged rock wall. He had already torn a strip from his robe to tie off the wound on his leg. He stared into the pitch-black depths of the cavern and swallowed hard. He muttered that the intel only mentioned 3 beasts, yet we had already run into 3 massive ones right at the start. He didn't finish his sentence, but his meaning was clear. He wanted to turn back. Chun-Hung ignored him. He turned his gaze toward me. He told me it was my call. Shou looked stunned, his mouth hanging open. He couldn't understand why a guy like Chun-Hung was deferring to the disciple who had ranked last in the sect. He had seen me use that strange sword technique earlier, but his mind hadn't caught up to the reality of it yet. My left hand was still leaking blood, but I didn't bother treating it. I looked down at my right palm. That bright, silver sword mark was resting quietly beneath my skin. I could feel it. Something was waiting for us deep inside that cave. It wasn't the feeling of a threat. It was a resonance. It felt like a vibration humming at the exact same frequency as the mark in my hand. I shifted the short blade to my right hand and gripped it tight. I told them we were going in. I was the first to step into the darkness. Chun-Hung followed immediately, and Shou cursed under his breath before limping along behind us. The tunnel was deeper than it looked from the outside. We walked for about 20 paces through a narrow passage where the walls were slick with moisture. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the metallic sting of blood. It grew darker with every step until we had to rely on the dim light of Chun-Heng's fire starter. When we reached the 7th step, Shou tripped over something. He looked down, and his face went white. A beast's carcass lay sprawled across the floor. It wasn't one of the ones we had killed. This one was even bigger, its body a full size larger than the ones at the entrance. The fatal wound was a thin, clean slit. It started under the jaw and pierced deep into the neck. The creature had been bled dry. Chun-Hung knelt down, bringing the flame closer to the wound. He noted that it was a single, perfect strike. The blade used was thin, and whoever held it had incredible wrist strength and zero hesitation. He stood up and walked a few more paces. The light revealed 2 more bodies. Same location, same wound, same terrifying precision. Sho looked like he was about to lose his mind. He whispered, wondering who the hell had gotten here before us. I knelt by the wound and traced the angle. The sword path was light, entering at a tricky upward tilt. This wasn't a frontal hack. The killer had waited for the beast to lunge, using the creature's own momentum to slide the blade into its throat. A specific name flashed through my mind, but I didn't say it out loud. I stood up and kept moving. The tunnel suddenly opened up into a massive natural cavern. It was wide, with a thin crack in the ceiling that allowed a sliver of natural light to fall onto the center of the floor. The moment we stepped inside, we all froze. A figure stood at the far end of the cave, his back turned to us. He wore deep gray robes cinched by a narrow leather belt, and a jade pendant on his hip glowed with a faint, steady light. He held a thin sword in his hand, the tip pointed toward the ground. Fresh blood slid slowly down the length of the steel, dripping onto the stone. At his feet, the bodies of several beasts were piled in a circle like a cleared battlefield. He heard our footsteps and turned around. It was Su Qin,